So here we are at last, the last chapter of the Proverbs, chapter 31. And so like always, or like of late, I'll begin this with a prayer. So dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. I thank you for focus. I have, that I have been trying to move closer in a relationship to you, to that thing that is aware and attentive as much and as often as it can be. And with that awareness, with that attention, there is that desire for the spirit of goodness. And I thank you for this. I thank you for the process of orienting the attention. Now there's something that came up today that I at once have difficulty describing exactly how to put it into words, to describe what it is. I wouldn't say that it is doubt, but there's an adjacent term, uncertainty perhaps, and the feelings that it spurs I find to be a continual effort to experience my way through them without having the feelings take something from my my principles and my foundation. And I pray, as with all contrary feelings, that as I discover and understand, know you better, that these feelings do not serve as a way to disrupt my mind, but rather to invigorate me, and to discover things that are unseen but are hidden by this unfortunate reversal of heart. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So as I mentioned, this is the last chapter in Proverbs, chapter 31. And I'm quite excited to get into this one. I'm excited to finish the Proverbs. Not necessarily because I think that one is ever done necessarily with religious affairs, but rather I'm glad to have experienced this book in the way that I have. I'm glad for anyone that has accompanied me on the journey. And for this, for anyone who may find themselves in the Proverbs, I hope that we can share a common spirit and move through this with the goal of moving closer to God, to establishing that logos, that centerpiece of mind that must necessarily be external to us, so that we may sacrifice appropriately and not get lost in ourselves. So verse 1, the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. What, my son? And what, the son of my womb? And what, the son of my vows? Give not your strength unto women, nor your ways to that which destroys kings. So, where to begin here. I don't want to spend too much time on the first two verses, but I think there's a couple words that can be said. The first thing, for myself, a prophecy is something that we don't think about, I think, in the contemporary era. Now, prophecy is a prediction. It is something that is said to be seen, of things that have yet to happen. And a prophecy, I think, is something that can be made by all sorts of different experiences. It can be made by strong reason. They can be made by loose association, by mystical experience. Some prophecies turn out to be false, some true, some accidental, and some quite amazing and deliberate in ways that we did not think were possible. And so the second verse, when presumably the mother that is speaking, she says, "What, my son? And what, the son of my womb? And what, the son of my vows?" There are three things here that she's referencing. And the question is, why? Why not just say, "What, my son"? Why go through the extra effort of saying these things? She says, "What, my son?" And then, "and what?" The clarification, the qualification, the son of my womb, this sort of indication, a matter of speech to orient the attention towards a fundamental relationship between that mother and son, that she is calling back a time in which she brought him into being. She nourished him in her belly, a very intimate image. And by belly, of course, I don't mean stomach, I mean womb. And what? The son of my vows. Now, her vows, supposedly, I think, are vows of marriage, and that the son, of course, is the product of that marriage. And so she's pointing again towards an intimate experience, about a commitment between two people to come together and to raise a human being. And so she asks, what? Now, she could be saying what in terms of his calling out to her, or she could be saying what in an inquisitive manner. And I tend to be inclined to believe that she is being poetic here. She is, in my mind, she has entered into a room where the son is doing whatever he's doing. She grabs his attention, and they embark on this journey. What? Give not your strength unto women. A rather strange thing to say in the beginning. Now, keeping in mind that Lemuel, the son, is a king. So why would it be the case not to give our strength to women? Well, let's talk a little bit about strength then. What can we say of it? Of the physical form of strength, there's an implication that we can move we can move a heavy load. We can generate power. We can do productive work. We are capable, physically capable. And that allows us to organize, to shift, to change, to bring together various material for our purposes. And of course, strength is important in military pursuits, in the pursuit of conquering, in the pursuit of subduing, in the pursuit of controlling. And much like in the physical context, strength in the mental, I think, occupies a similar role. Not that it is entirely negative, of course, because strength is something that is foundational, that is something that provides the mind with a sense of security, but also with a resting key, let's say, the key of the mind, for which we always know that tone to come back to. We always know where we may rest, may find solace. And there's a certain certainty within this home that I think gives us strength. It is something of a foundation for us. A foundation is something of a sturdy base of support for which we do not falter, or at least it is made difficult for us to be disturbed from such a place. So this is a matter of giving. If we are to give our strength to somebody else, forget whether or not it be a woman, if we give it to a woman, if we give it to anybody, I imagine myself or somebody else standing on firm footing, a nice level piece of concrete, for example. And then just next to it, or just all around it, maybe I should say, is a marshy, boggy landscape. The concrete is not disturbed by this landscape. Perhaps it runs deep enough to be foundational, and once one climbs upon it, they no longer sink into the muddy abyss. If we are to just give this over to somebody, then we ourselves are now on this unshaky ground. We are uncertain, unknowing, subdued. Now the woman, I think there are many things that can be said here. But if we think about a distinction, we must think about its fundamental distinction. And it's not necessarily the case that if we said man in this sort of manner that it would be a false statement, because it's probably also true that one ought not to give strength to another man. I think the consequences are just a little different. Now, in terms of the woman, I think it is implied that there is a potential romantic relationship there, that the woman has that potential to seduce, to subdue the king, and to gain his seed so that she can propagate his line. But if she takes his foundation, then she effectively takes his position as a strong ruler. She subdues his authority. So give not your strength to women, nor ways to that which destroys kings. Which, of course, is quite a broad statement, because it could be a number of things. And then she goes into the first one. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink. And it continues on into the next verse, verse 5, which is separated by a colon. Lest they drink and forget the law, and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Now this is an important statement. So we're talking about a mind-altering substance, of course. We're talking about a fundamental thing to remember, that is the law, that is the binding of peoples together, of institutions, that it sets the parameter of acceptable intercourse between people. And the disruption of this intercourse, the disruption of that binding force, material, can lead to profound instability. We can think of any material object. We could think about the things that hold it up. We could think about the supports in a car, the supports of a building. I think about the supports of my desk, or the supports of the chair that I'm sitting on. If the nature of the object that I was sitting on was somehow perverted by some substance, such that it was not able to maintain some sort of constitution, it would fall, and I can no longer utilize its purpose, its function. And because I cannot utilize its purpose, its value has been reduced. Meaning has been reduced. And since people who are interested in goodness and in God are interested in expanding meaning and goodness and value, this is not a way to be. Now, one can change the law because a law does not fulfill a particular purpose, or to fix it, just like one can fix a chair that is broken. Lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Now this is a staple, well, maybe not a staple, but it's commonplace in the history of mankind to pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. The afflicted being someone that is carrying a particular burden. Maybe they're positionally, generationally bound to a particular position. Perhaps it is a disease. Perhaps it is that they are a victim of some crime. Perhaps they are down on their luck by no fault of their own. We want the judges in our society to be seeing in such a way that they are able to identify that which is true and that which is false. Matters of justice are never easy, I suppose, but to identify true innocence and to identify true guilt, I think, provides law with a certain rigor at its foundation that is necessary for a strong society. And to distort that very process by which the law and the decision behind the law, it is to make us as a human being into an animal that is less capable, less able to see that which is good, able to see that which is right. It creates a strong confusion, altered state of mind, just like the drink alters the state of mind. Lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be heavy of hearts. Now this advice, I suppose, can go a number of different ways. Now, a man that is at the end of his life, the goal is to reduce his pain and suffering. We do this in the modern day. We place people in the hospice so that they can fall into death with grace and with relative ease. So the physical sufferings of the body allow the mind to breathe and to reflect on life before passing. and wine unto those that be heavy of heart. And here, this is one of those statements that can go either way. A heart that is heavy may turn to drink to prevent that reconciliation, or the reduction of the load, the transformation of burdens into some actionable, positive experience. But there's also the way in which the heavy heart, much like the person that is about to die, that the heavy heart may be dulled. It may be warmed once again, perhaps temporarily, by the drink. This is something of a curious matter, and I have to wonder why the mother is of such an opinion. Not that I am contrary to alcohol, but a heavy heart, I think, requires a sober mind in order for it to be transformed, in order for it to appropriately understand what burdens it. To have reason to have the feelings find a home in reason. And to have those feelings given space to burn upon the fuel of its cause. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his misery no more. So there's this pattern of experiencing difficulty, and then providing a medication of this sort maybe, such that the individual is unable to attend to that pain. And I have to wonder about this still. Open your mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Now, before moving on to this, I want to identify some curious thing. That the mother says that the wine, or the drink, is not for kings nor princes. Strong drink, that is. Because they may forget the law. And yet there is the recommendation to give drink to those that may perish, wine to those that may be heavy of heart, those who are impoverished. This is something surely that will come back again. Maybe one last statement on this. It would seem that the people who are heavy of heart or are impoverished would want to maintain some idea of the law. I suppose there are various levels of this law that we can identify. Perhaps it wouldn't help much of the impoverished to understand all the ins and outs of civil law. But of the law of behavior and the law of cultural interaction, maybe. Surely it's important to know in order to get themselves out of such a state of misery, rather than to be plunged farther into it. The streets are full of poor that have drink. Open your mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Such an interestingly worded verse here. So let's focus on the first part. Open your mouth for the dumb. Now, this is in a particular cause. Now, The mouth is something that we've discussed before, and I think it's easily underdone and also overdone. So we have to be a little careful about how we move through the symbol of the mouth. As far as man is concerned, this is one of the fundamental devices, tools that he has to transmit meaning from his mind into the environment. There's also a strong relationship between the mouth and the health of the body. It brings up the concept of the agent and the extended parts of the agent. To open the mouth is a type of action. It is suggestive of displaying meaning or reason for a particular purpose or cause. Now, saying for the dumb we do so. But what cause? In the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. So there's a sense of righteousness here in which the king has an obligation to those who we call dumb. Now, these dumb people may be born of like a mental retardation, I think, which is likely what it is referring to here. Those who are unable to open their mouths for themselves, let's say. And so they are appointed to destruction because they cannot participate in society. They are designated by the natural way of things to be reduced, to be destroyed. It's followed up by verse 9, open your mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. And so although there is that contrast between the king not being allowed to drink and then those who are afflicted to drink, it is now saying that there's the suggestion that they can ease their pain while the king will stand up for them. The king will dictate in a right manner and stand up for those who are of poor means. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. Now here's an interesting topic. That of worth, that of value. And rubies being that common coin of exchange. There is this idea that we've explored before in the Proverbs, that money of this type, or material of this type that stores value, cannot store all value. Just because we have it doesn't mean that we are rich per se. Just because we have it doesn't mean that everything that is valuable may be bought by it. And so there's this indication or implication that the woman, if she be virtuous, then she is one of these things that cannot be bought by rubies. Because there's a certain contradiction, it would seem, between the expression of virtue, the maintenance of a strong relationship with a woman that is virtuous, and that of being reduced to the carrying capacity of money, or rubies in this case. Now, today is a new day. I conducted my prayer privately today. I want to get right back into this verse. I can't remember if I had mentioned this yesterday, but there has been a conversation recently on one of the episodes about, this has been a theme generally throughout the Proverbs, that there is this idea that value I don't want to sound too superficial here, but I'll expand it as I go. That value is not something that can be reduced to money. That there is things that are valuable that extend beyond the material. And, of course, with most things, with all things in human affairs, I think we can say that the things that we find valuable will find their way into some material apparatus and form. Money is a vehicle. It is a transportation mechanism to hold potential, essentially, exchangeable information for other material goods, or for simple elements to produce more complex structures from them. Whether that be a building or some other product, a chair, whatever. And there are things that we build, of course, to satisfy our purposes, like we build houses to establish homes. We establish homes such that we can have a family and that we can live out our lives and establish a foundation of love, ideally. And so I say this to say that when I think about rubies, I think about something that is temporary, in the sense that the value is going to flow through it, that is not going to stay there forever. Even the relative value of the ruby itself will fluctuate and change. So where exactly do we go from here? The verses that follow this are going to be focused on the virtuous woman. So what is a virtuous woman will be expressed to us, and by that we can identify what the virtues are. And so I probably won't spend much time here on discussing virtue. But a quick definition of the term: virtue is behavior showing high moral standards. So the verse that immediately follows this one, who can find a virtuous woman, for her price is far above rubies. Verse 11, the heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. So I'd like to establish the environment through which we can see this a little bit more clearly. The heart of her husband trusts in her. A statement that is simple enough, I suppose. But experientially, what does this mean? I like to speak about the heart in expansive terms. So the heart is something that I have referred to many times as at once an industrial factory. Also, I've discussed it in terms of a central part, if not half, of our cognitive capacity. We can say that there is a primitive aspect to it, to a degree, though I would not wish to reduce it to such language. The heart is a mode or an aspect of our experience, an aspect of our conscious experience. The heart as an identity, I think, has a degree of agency to it. It doesn't necessarily require reason to function, although it functions in the totality of the human being. It's a necessary relationship between reason and the heart. The heart is the seat of our desires and our emotions. The industrial factory, although it's not a great analogy, I think it serves us to satisfy some specific functions of the heart. And I think the economic example of emotion is apt, in the sense that a factory will produce, just in general, it will produce stuff if there is demand for it in the broader environment or economy. It is also possible that we may feel some desire or emotion without the pull of the external environment, and it's sort of the reverse, that the external environment is modified to shape the desire of the heart. So there's this sort of two-way mechanism at play here. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her. So what does it mean to safely trust in someone? What does it mean to trust someone? When I think about the relationships that I have, and I think about the trust that I have developed within these relationships, I recognize that these are people that I can count on. I have a certain belief that they have my best interest in mind, that I can leave with them not just material things, but also memories, thoughts, an aspect of myself that I find deeply personal and difficult to place in the hands of any person without a strong relationship. And so what does this mean for our relationship? And it's not just a one-way street, I'll have to say. But let me at least try to answer that question first. What does it mean? I think it means that if we are speaking about something that is valuable, which we are, of course, we're talking about a virtuous woman, she is supposedly valuable. But we think about anything that can be possibly valuable. And of the things that I mentioned, relatively recently I had an experience that I was talking to a friend about an incident that happened when I was young that probably has had some long-lasting effects into adulthood. And that's something that they're aware of. We don't talk about it very often, but it's something that came up. And it's something that I feel that I can trust this person to handle with care, to understand and to value it in the way that I might value it, to place it on the same level, let's say. There's a mutual recognition of value. Now, while we may not think the same things, while we may not exactly have the same emotional connection over these events, whereas my emotional connection might be more strong than my friends, they're still able to move into that mode of empathy, such that it may stir the heart, it may not, but at least it stirs the reason to place a concept in that storage space of mind, that it has a sacred quality to it. So I'd like to keep this idea of mutual value as we move forward. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her. So mutual valuing, now I said earlier that the heart has a degree of agency to it, which means that it has the ability to act independent of reason to a degree. Now here's where the primitive sense comes in the way that a reflex might be something that is considered primitive. There's not much reason in it. In fact, we consider reflexes to be something that is involuntary. And yet by the sensing of the heart we may detect when something is wrong, when we are in danger, or when something bad is happening to somebody else. That there is a change in the atmosphere that we can detect. And I think that this is the heart's domain, to be responsible for detecting this and responding to it. And sometimes the heart, I think, can respond to it before our reason can. And not to make this a dualist thing, I think that the two are so fundamental that they often form a lockstep before we can even reflect on the matter. But I think, of course, we all have these experiences for which one may be separate from another before they merge again. So when we think about the heart having this ability to trust, if we take away our reason from the situation, not to take away it in the sense to describe what we are conceptualizing, but to take away reason from the experience, if I think about a loved one, and I think about my heart trusting a person, I can say that this trust at the foundation of it has a feeling in mind. I don't think that's all that there is. I think that there is a strong ontological experience or formation that occurs when these types of relationships are established. Now, why do I say that? Because on the matter of being, and if I am for a moment to take some liberty and say that of being, we could think about orientation of a person. Our orientation is a reflection of attention. It is a reflection of, again, the heart, which is plays a role in our attention, where that centerpiece of mind goes to focus. There are certain ways in which we behave, I think, around people that we care about and that we trust versus a superficial relationship or a coworker, for example. It may not be vastly different, but I think that there is a difference. In fact, I was overhearing a conversation by a coworker earlier today discussing about her role as mother in the relationship. And there was an interesting reflection about how that role is established and how her professional life is necessarily separated from that. And that if she tries to bring into that relationship her tools or her skills, it can often fall on deaf ears because of the way in which the family is structured. Fortunate or not, that's not really for me to comment on, but I mention it because it's interesting in the way that, as I think about close relationships of mine, how this intimacy and how this vulnerability can limit certain things and make others more available. There's a certain beauty in trust. Again, the making of things available. It is a tool. There are many words I think that I can use here. I think about money for whatever reason because it is this storehouse of value that you can do something with. Affordance, that's a word I was sort of looking for. It affords a certain type of experience. It influences the way in which we are oriented. It influences the ontology. So, for example, if I went to a close friend's house, or maybe if I said, in the first instance, I'm struggling with something, I need to have an intimate conversation to flesh this out. I need you to go along with the journey, with me on this journey. And we'd schedule a time to do that, and I trust the person, and we would enter into this space for which it would afford us an opportunity to solve some problem. So I think that that's one example of how trust may operate, or how if somebody has a heart within somebody else, trusting in somebody else, that this may operate. It's not limited to this. So the heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. Now, what is this spoil? There are two definitions that come to mind. There's one in which the spoil is riches. It can refer to excess. There's another in which spoil is something ruinous. It is something contrary. If something is spoiled, it is rotten. It is not safe for consumption. I think both ends of this sort of have an implication of a shared commonality. In the sense of riches, the spoil of riches, there is that possibility of overgorging on material goods, or of becoming too prideful or conceited in one's achievements. And on the other hand, of course, the type of spoil that is more direct, directly something that is rotten, something that just needs to be separated from us. So because of the affairs of the heart, because of the trust that it places in a virtuous woman, both situations, but perhaps more of the type of that strong riches for which a man may be motivated to continually move and act in the world such that they achieve more and more and more, and it's never really something that satisfies. They're always looking to something to take away their inadequacies or their lack of sense of worth or value, whatever it might be. And the reason that it doesn't happen in the case of the virtuous woman, because she has all of the riches available for him to partake in, to experience, that he is satisfied in her. So one of our first lessons here, I think, in terms of virtue, when we are thinking about the virtuous woman, if a virtuous person is going to be one that has the capacity to instill confidence in somebody else's heart, a true confidence, such that they do not abuse it, and they maintain the heart of another within their experience, that she is able to empathize, to share common conceptualization of value. This type of relating among human beings, I think, can be said is a virtue. Whatever word for that there is, I'm not sure. Honesty, trustfulness. There's many things, I think, that can be said there. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. So this verse is a bit more broad. It's a bit more general. But I still think that there is something that we can take from this. She will do him good. I think there's a big conversation to be had there about exactly what that means. And I sort of wonder at the direction to go there. I think at the very least, or at the outset, we can say that a virtuous person is concerned with good things. And so, since she is virtuous, she will be concerned with doing right by him. Again, the definition of virtue is behavior showing high moral standards. Now, if we look at the etymology of the word virtue, we have of Latin origin virtus, which meant manliness, valor, excellence, or worth, rooted in vir, meaning man, as in male person, but also implying strength, courage, and honor. In Middle English, via the Old French, we have the word virtute, or vertu, during the Middle Ages, and this was meant as a broad concept related to moral excellence, righteousness, and chastity. So we have this symbolic, archetypal rootedness to the word of virtue that implies a strength that must necessarily be rooted in some foundational, underlying moral framework. And this framework is good. Of course, all of us are in a position where we may be wrong, or we may not have all of the pieces of the puzzle completely figured out. And that leaves us open to error and to misjudgment. But for the most part, a solid moral framework, I think, assists a person in being good. That making effective decisions is enhanced by a strong moral framework. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. So evil would be the process of bringing the man to absence, or bringing their relationship to absence and to nothingness. And there's a lot of psychological tricks that can be utilized there on the part of a person that is evil, an evil spouse. We don't necessarily have to go in that. I've discussed evil quite a bit throughout these reflections. She seeks wool and flax, and works willingly with her hands. Now this is significant. More significant. When I read it the first time, I think as I read it now the second time, it's more significant than the first. There's in my experience, in my life, there has been this recognition where I fail most readily. And it is that constant attention, number one, but number two, that association of the attention and motivation or drive. So today is a new day. It happens to be the evening, and it also happens to be a moment where I'm on the verge of a sickness. I have a cold coming on, and I have the body aches. And it's times like this where I often refer to in mind as some of the experiences that really tempt the mind away from that which is good, because we're constantly thinking about what we are feeling. And this is not something that's unreasonable, of course. There are plenty of good reasons why the mind focuses on the body when it aches and when it is falling into sickness. But as a matter of continuance, of thinking about where the prayers have been, where the interpretations of the verses have been lately, that the attention has been so central to this experience. I think now, and I reflect now, on the way my mind is operating, given the condition that it is in. So, dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. I thank you for presence of mind, despite distraction, despite fatigue and exhaustion. And I pray that when I find those moments, despite my physical condition, when I find those moments for which I am tempted away, or I have difficulty concentrating, that I find a center in you, and that I move closer to you, such that I can reestablish myself firmly in the context of my experience. And with this I pray, in Jesus' name, amen. So to recenter where we were yesterday, I'm bringing the attention back to attention itself. I had mentioned that there's a constant in my life where difficulties have come because of my failure of attention, and my failure of that motivation to keep on going, the drive to push forward. And what I see in this verse, she seeks wool and flax and works willingly with her hands. What I see here is a person that is devoted to production, that is, a believer in the generative aspect of our experience, somebody interested in creation. And I also think about the subtle ways in which attention, or the lack thereof, can have these cascade of consequences. And in particular, I think about those moments where I may be sitting at my desk, or I may be in between different tasks, and I allow my mind to go blank. Now, I don't necessarily think that a passivity of mind is entirely a bad thing. I think there's a certain place for it. But all the same, in terms of our productive time, our productive hours, the continuation of attention is something that is important. And the discipline that's required to establish it, I think, is an art. Now, to speak more specifically about this verse, it mentions the will. It also mentions a few materials here, which I'll have to think about in greater detail and assess its significance. But at the very least, the will is the axis of this verse. It is that part of man that makes decisions. It is that part of him that accepts what is in front of him, whether it be one thing or multiple things that he must choose. The will is that deciding factor of mind. It's the point at which the mind centers itself into some actionable behavior. And I suppose that we can speak of it more broadly as well. That while the will may not necessarily be an action or a behavior, it may lead to that. But the will is something of potential, operating with the constraints that are afforded us. And within this domain, debates about the existence of free will, it really doesn't interest me. Because as far as I'm concerned, there are many more possibilities for which my mind cannot wrap its head around than I understand of limitation. And because of this, I think likely impossibility And I'm hoping that what I had said there is correct. To reiterate, to put in different words, that of my experience, I know that I am unable to understand all of the possibilities for which I may act, nor do I understand all of the ways in which I am limited in my action. I understand many of them, surely. But I am reminded that I am a being of a particular level and scale. I possess the capacity to see beyond my immediate senses, which I am thankful for. And I can go quite far in this domain. But I think about Genesis, and I think about that tree, the tree of knowledge, and the knowledge of those fundamental principles of good and of evil. And how, although we seem to be faced at every turn with these distinctions, the variability that they produce is so vast, and the interrelatedness among things so difficult to determine exactly where evil begins and where it ends, or where goodness begins and where it ends, is quite difficult for man. We can find it, we can localize it, we can observe it in various contexts. But all the same, that spiritual domain for which understanding the whole of it is beyond us, is beyond any one person's capacity. And I have to think back now at what I mentioned about my experience, at there having been intermittent periods of my life for which I have fallen into absence, perhaps a depressed state of mind for which I lose that generative belief, the belief in creation. And when that happens, I fail to seek working willingly with my hands. I wish not to gather the appropriate materials because of the concern that I have for goodness and of evil. And if this is not a death of the mind, I don't know what is. And so when God says in Genesis, "Of every tree in the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it. For in the day that you eat thereof you shall surely die." And again, I can't think of a death that is more unfortunate than the death of mind in a body that still draws life. A contradiction, it would seem. So what is the significance of the wool and flax in this verse? I think it is a reflection of the will of this person, of the virtuous will of this person. And while I mentioned that there is a possibility of being paralyzed by the amount of actions that we may take, creating and producing has a degree of innocence, I think, to it. Especially when we were thinking about creating something that is fundamental to us. Now, if we think about somebody that is creating a weapon, maybe it's more difficult to justify. But somebody that is gathering wool and flax, what they are probably going to do is to produce clothing. Clothing being something fundamental to keep us warm and to survive. Moreover from that, wool and flax, something necessary to create linen, involve a process that must include discipline, which is a virtue. It is a behavior that is showing a high moral standard. And it is because of that time, that attention, and that discipline towards the purposes of producing that this woman is seen as virtuous. It's one of the reasons that she is seen as virtuous. And she chooses this over the other that maybe may take, or that is lazy, that does not wish to use her hands, and that suffers because of it. suffers cold, suffers homelessness, suffers hunger, suffers relationally. She is like the merchant's ship. She brings her food from afar. So this is a rather strange one. How do we tie this back to virtue? So to be like a merchant's ship, we have to understand the nature of the merchant. The merchant is somebody that travels long distances. They go on voyages. They traverse difficult terrain. It is a potentially rewarding discipline, given somebody that is able to maintain a constant supply. She is like merchants' ships, so she is like the ship, the one that takes the journey into a potentially unknown land, for a purpose, no doubt, but a land that is unknown, that is full of potential dangers. She brings her food from afar. She brings something that is fundamental for the survival of man through the perilous journey, to provide for her husband and for herself, of course. And so in what way would we say that this is virtuous? Well, in the words that I had just described, I think it would be difficult to say that if somebody goes on a journey in which they must sacrifice, that they must accept a degree of uncertainty. That uncertainty begging the question, will I survive this journey? Will there be something that happens to my ship abroad? Will there be somebody that takes advantage of my station or my wares, the objects, the materials that I have, takes advantage of me physically? To put this aside and say, no, there is something that is good here that is worth pursuing, aside or besides the potential evil that may exist out there in the world. And although it is not certain that a good outcome will happen, the will is such that she can commit her mind to goodness. And I think that this is enough. For otherwise, the mind would be stationary, and eventually it would lead to absence and death. She rises also while it is yet night, and gives meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. So with this verse, my mind goes immediately to night. This seems to be the center point. There's also giving, which I think is another important axis for which we have to describe. But there's something about the nighttime and the reference therein. She rises also while it is yet night. And the idea there is that the nighttime, as the day has passed and the nighttime befalls us, it is that period for which we are winding down. We are entering a place of I suppose I can say passivity, but it's not passivity in the negative sense. It's passivity, or maybe leisure, but again, not leisure in the negative sense. It is a type of passivity or of leisure. I don't like the word leisure here, but I'll stick with passivity. Passivity such that the productive energies of the day are usually not established here. The productive energies are unwound. Of course, unwound in a productive way. We don't just immediately go from a state of attentiveness to a state of inattentiveness. We go to that state of hyperarousal to a state of arousal to a state of graceful slumber, I suppose. And I think in that process, prayer is it is necessary. It's a certain type of prayer. It's a prayer of that deep self-reflection. It's a prayer that we can find ourselves in a safe place, a place that we understand to be an environment to create and to reflect on the more hyper-aroused states of being that we experience throughout our life or during the day, whatever it happens to be, a reflective posturing of mind. And so there's this inclination, there is this pointing to the idea that this woman, and by extension, virtue, since this woman is to be virtuous, that by her behavior she is demonstrating virtue by, what would it be? We could say, I suppose, on one side of it, sacrificing. But here we have to pay attention to the goods and also of the potential downsides to maintaining this productive energy at night. On one hand, in the situation in which we have a person that abandons all attentiveness in their unproductive hours, and I think even unproductive hours has an intricate definition to it, because in my mind I almost tend to think that productive hours are only working hours, which of course are not the case. But not to make this too complex, there is a certain attribute, there's a certain condition, positive condition, that is attributed to a person that is able to rouse themselves for the good despite being fatigued, despite being at the end of a productive process. To be so in tune and to be so faithful that they can reignite that flame and to provide and to generate again anew. And I think that there's something so fundamental within that flame, within the spark and the reignition and the subsequent giving, that is virtuous. It necessarily involves discipline. It necessarily involves attention towards that which is good. And of course the integration of those together. So let's speak of giving just for a moment, because this is fundamental to this virtuous cycle that we're talking about. So in my hand I have an object. Exactly what it is doesn't matter too much. And I recommend if anybody finds themselves in this portion of the recording to find themselves an object just to use as a tool or a prop to imagine what this process of giving might signify. So I have something in my hand, and I attribute to it a certain value. And now why do I do that? For the purposes of this reflection and discovery in terms of the virtue of giving or the value of giving, I think it could be said that if I'm going to give something to somebody that doesn't mean anything to me, then there's something that I think is missing in terms of a perfect, or maybe not a perfect, but a good interaction of giving. Now, it's not necessary, and forgive me as I work my way through this, but I can also imagine a scenario or a situation in which I give somebody a piece of clothing. Maybe it doesn't fit me anymore, And so the value to me is quite low, but to somebody that doesn't have clothing, the value would be quite high. And so giving in this sense, while it doesn't really cost me anything, does good. So there is this aspect of giving. The other, I could say, is that if there is something that is worth something to me, and I choose to give it to somebody else, let's say for nothing, then I have sacrificed that value, my attachment to the object, in order to satisfy the need of another. And I think that there is some value in that as well. And the value, I think, the additional value that we get from this, as opposed to the former, is that there is a process for which I have to give something up. I have to sacrifice something. Within the process of sacrifice and giving up, I think there is a coming to recognition of that which is truly valuable. In the case of something that has been given up that is valuable, we return to something that is more fundamental. A layer of the onion has been removed or released. Okay, we refer back, we retreat back to the more fundamental layer, and we find value there. And in so doing, we don't become insular, but I think we become more principled, because those foundational principles are the ones that uphold us. They maintain our identity, they maintain our relationship to God. Now there's another aspect of giving, and this is the one that excites my heart quite a bit. There's the aspect of giving that is more methodical, it is planned. It may not be, but at least in my mind, when I think about giving, I think about some method and plan to establish a stronger connection among different elements. The different elements in this case, when we think about the maidens of the household, the servants in the household, but it could be expanded to anybody in the household. Any identity that we want to make this. It can be of a family, it can be of a corporate office, it can be of a friend group, anything. To strengthen that thing, we can find ourselves in what I'm going to call a posture, a stance, an orientation of giving, such that, like in the case that we have here, a woman preparing food, something fundamental to survival, but also something that connects people together. A meal can do wondrous things for relationships. The overarching environment that's set, given a meal, I think can do wonders for the overarching identity. It can afford an experience, much like the Proverbs afford us an experience to learn and to have insights about things. And again, I mentioned that it can be methodical and planned, or it can be more spontaneous. But either way, even of the spontaneous sort, there has to be this idea in mind that what is being given, or what is being prepared, and something that is given could be time, it could be labor, it could be effort. That which is given is developed when it is decided on. That if I decide to give something away, or more fundamentally, as in the case of this verse, the woman wishes to prepare meat. She rises in the night, she arouses her senses at night to prepare something. So she goes through this process, much like the verse before. There is this disciplined process, attention to detail. She is putting different elements together to produce clothing, which is, again, a fundamental thing. It's something that is needed. It is something that is inherently valuable, that she will give and provide for various people, no doubt. And so this spurring to attention, given off hours, given hours of fatigue and of exhaustion, to sacrifice in order to bring together, I think it's a virtue, but I think we could say that virtue is wisdom is a virtue, because what she is doing is bringing together different pieces, different nodes of the network, and creating a strong network. This is a wise decision. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. So here we find an extension of what we've been talking about. A person that is committed to attention, committed to wisdom, committed to bringing components together, committed to goodness, committed to creation, production. So let's try and symbolize this here. Open up the symbols maybe. And let's have an experience with this verse. She considers a field and buys it. Now this is a topic that has been in my mind perhaps at some intuitive level, but I don't think that I have had the opportunity to bring it forth. And I'd like to do that now. So what do I mean by this? Thinking about potential is such a strategic, or maybe I should say a potential for strategic enjoyment. That doesn't sound very poetic, I suppose, but there's a certain way in which a blank slate or potential can rouse the productive energies, can stimulate our most passionate inklings. And I think because of that process of creation, by organizing information, and here I of course think about Genesis and the way that this story is outlined for us, the way it begins through this series of simple but fundamental, axiomatic types of information, and then becomes organized, defined in the sense that things are given identity, and then there's this identity explosion from that which is mind. Now the interesting thing is, when I think about this layer for which mind has given birth to something else or something new, I wonder about the newness, and I wonder about the space that it is produced into. For newness, in that sense, implies that there is an outside, I suppose. And here, this question, I think, is asked at a very small scale, the scale of the human mind. But nonetheless, perhaps it is a hubristic thing to imagine outside of it, when there really is that inclination to understand things independent of our subjective experience. That this takes us only so far, and that the subject, while flawed, is something that is fundamental because it is our experience of it. It is our life in it. It is how it is portrayed to us. And so remembering that we are thinking about this in the context of the field, the context of potential, at some level, I don't think that there is any difference between that broad cosmological scale and what we see here. It is just an extension, a microcosm of that. And so perhaps our experience of it can help us understand what is occurring upstream. So here we find ourselves in an interesting space. So I want to talk about the field as a concept. Now I want to go through an exercise that is going to use perhaps an analogy or two to outline this field. Now when I look at the word field, it's hard for me not to think about the other ways in which the word field can be used. And many of us will know that in physics the word field is used. And symbolically, since we are thinking about the broader field as an area of potential, I wonder, by the same token, what is meant by the physical field, or the field as a term that is described in physics. So in physics, a field is a physical quantity assigned to every point in space and time. It describes how forces or influences extend through space, even in the absence of direct contact between objects. And there are various types of these fields in physics. But they all share in that idea that something fills space and can exert effects at a distance. So I want to go a little bit farther into this. So there can be fields that are scalar, vector, or tensor in nature. Now a scalar field, this is a single number to every point in space. Now this is interesting. In and of itself, it doesn't really tell us the purpose yet, but we can at least assign something. We can assign an identity, let's say, to a point in space. This space is our field, and what we compute into it, perhaps, how we see it, or what objects, what things that we choose to identify. In this sense, we're attributing quantities to it. We haven't really defined the quantities yet, but within this space of potential, we are now identifying possibilities. Now, the possibility so far seems quite minimal. What are we going to do with a number that doesn't really define anything? But this is basic. We're just defining possibility of this possibility. So again, a scalar field is something that assigns a single number to every point in space. An example of this would be temperature in a room. At each point in the room, there is a specific temperature. Some may be quite close, some may be a bit different within the same room. Now, temperature is a good example of something that is meaningful to us, to our subjective experience. In the sense that temperature is a measurement that we can feel, or we can measure it outside of our feeling, perhaps, but nonetheless, temperature, although we may attribute to it some physical quantity, or it defines some physical quantity, it is also experienced by us. So right now, as I experience temperature in this room, I feel a sense of coolness. It's not very cold, but it is cool. It's not warm, it's not hot. So going back to what I was saying, that at the basic definition, at least, of this one particular type of field, the scalar, it begins to become more clear. Now, the temperature itself, it may not tell us, it still doesn't really tell us much purposeful information. It's still kind of basic. It's good for us to know, but it's a teeny tiny point in the much broader way that we conceptualize it when we think of she considered a field. There are so many things that we have just adapted to and intuitively go through to behave and to act in the world that on one hand, perhaps we take for granted, but on the other, it's amazing because we have such a level of experience that we are able to do such things independently. Independently of what I think is fascinating conversation, fascinating series of questions that come from that. So a vector field is another type of field. It assigns a vector, which is a quantity with a direction and magnitude, to every point in space. An example of this is wind velocity or the electric field. The electric field at a point tells you which direction and how strongly a charged particle would move. So let's think about this again in the context of the field, the symbolic field that we are in. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth between the symbolic field, which is our home base, this is the key that we're in, and the field of physics that is helping us describe things in a particular level of detail. And I think that there will be a broader discussion on this. There must be a broader discussion on this to complete the verse. But again, I wish to go through this exercise because it is a process or a project of expansion, of expanding knowledge. So again, going back to that basic concept of the vector field, we have a quantity now that describes, that is defined with direction and magnitude. Now, direction is fairly straightforward. It's nice to know it's traveling in some direction relative to something. And then magnitude, there can be various quantities that are described with this characteristic that may refer to the size of something, the amount of something, the quantity of something. So velocity, for example. Okay, so we have these concepts. Is there something that we ought to say at this fundamental level, at this fundamental layer? How might we relate this to the field of the conscious experience? When we look at a field and we imagine the purposes that could be planted in it. Now, I say this metaphorically because although we are considering literally planting something into the ground so that it grows and produces, we have to recognize that the field of the ancient world has expanded quite a bit to include things of the modern and post-industrial age. And when I say things, I mean more so environments that allow us to do things, new types of fields. And so again, the question is, how can we relate this at a more fundamental level to our own experience, subjective experience? Now, we don't necessarily take measurements. Well, maybe I should be careful here about my words, but I want to say that we don't take measurements when we look at a field. We may, but it's not necessarily to establish our purposes. It may be to confirm or to deny a certain idea or purpose to see if it is possible, if a field is able to maintain that possibility. In order to do that, we have to identify certain nodes, identify them, give them, by identifying them, we give them an identity. We may not necessarily give them a quantity, or we may, whatever we use in that process. But we have in mind already something that is quite intricate. Again, it's on an intuitive plane. It takes, not necessarily for granted, but it takes liberty with being a conscious agent at this level of experience that we can sort of synthesize all of this information. I say this again because it saves us when we look at a field from more of the fundamental groundwork. That purpose comes so naturally to us as we think about a field of conscious experience, or we start with the presupposition that there is this, again, I should be careful with my language, but we live through the self. We live through conscious experience. And it is because of this, a conscious experience, which is sort of like a field in and of itself. Of course, it is built upon other types of physical fields. It does have this sort of representative field-like quality, both in the physical sense, but also in the symbolic sense. So today is a new day. I have said my prayer in private, and I wish to continue now. So, it's always a difficult thing to figure out exactly where to begin anew, especially if a previous recording had finished in the middle of a thought. But I wish to pick up where we were talking about fields. And I was going through the various physical fields and trying to draw some sort of relationship between them. Now, I wish to avoid the type of relationship between the symbolic and the physical that tends to be an overstretch, an overstatement, or it tends to place connections that just really are not there. But rather I wish to approach this in the spirit of recognizing ideas that will spur the mind into a greater symbolic resonance, I guess, with the divine. And so I may dip every once in a while into an association of a physical expression that just does not quite add up to our symbolic goals, and for that I'm sorry, but I am actively trying. So I believe last time I had left off with talking about vector fields, and I'm not exactly sure where this went. I know that I was saying something about conscious experience and how this can be sort of a field, and I think it was this conversation that had led me to want to mention that I do not want to overstretch the closeness of relation here, because it is possible that the relation that I'm trying to draw is just not a good one, and so therefore it shouldn't be close. But what I do wish to say is that the mind, there are similar things that we have explored in terms of physical fields that can be attributed to the mind. And although from my journey and perspective I haven't, or maybe I have to a degree, but certainly there haven't been quantities associated with these things in the symbolic sense, and the way that I conceptualize conscious experience. I don't have various quantities that might be associated with neural impulses, for example, or groupings of neural impulses that would formulate my understanding of my experience. Perhaps there's some that do. Great. But this journey is more so for lived experience. It's very heart heavy. And as somebody that talks a lot about the dangers of the heart and talks about what that structure is, I think I'm more of an emotional person, so this fits me well. This approach fits me well. So where exactly should we go from here? I'm thinking less about staying on the vector fields and then going on to the next type here, tensor fields. So a tensor field is, again, another physical field that has more complex quantities or tensors associated with each point. And these are used in general relativity and material physics. An example, the stress field in a solid, or the gravitational field in Einstein's theory. So I want to read a couple common physical fields. The gravitational field describes how mass attracts mass. Earth's gravitational field tells you how a mass would accelerate if dropped. An electric field created by electric charges. It describes the force a charge would feel at any point in space. A magnetic field arising from moving charges, currents. It influences other moving charges and magnetic materials. Electromagnetic field, a combination of electric and magnetic fields. It propagates as light and other electromagnetic waves. So to break here for a moment, think about this field in a different way. There is a connection here that I think is fundamental to us, in the sense that we are talking about this productive field for which our virtuous woman is now laying her sights upon for her purposes. Again, she's a virtuous woman. She considers the field. She buys it for a particular purpose, and she plants productive seeds to grow for the future. And the fascinating thing is that the product that is gathered from the vines, the grapes, whatever, with the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. There, to say that. I find it interesting that there is this fruit, the fruit of her hands, like there has been a process that has already occurred to, a generative process that has already occurred to produce these fruits. Now her hands, and she undergoes the next generative process, and then there are these new fruits, the fruits that are to sustain the body, to create, to fall back on physical processes to maintain the identity of the individual. Now, the reason that I was stuttering there a little bit is because I have this thought about that relationship between the symbolic field and the physical field. And given our definition about the field in the sense of physics, in which there is a point in space and in time that we attribute some quantity to, and there's various things that we can define that quantity as. My attention is on space and time. On one hand, I find it unfortunate. On the other hand, I find it curious. In the sense that I find it unfortunate, I have to wonder about these two distinctions, space and time. Why do we limit fields based on these things? It would seem that, well, just to back up for a moment, when we take the field in the sense that if I look out my window and I see a vacant lot available to do whatever for commercial or other purposes, I don't necessarily, well, I think there's an intuitive sense about which I understand what I'm able to do in that space. There are certain limitations. Now, in our sense, in our experience, there's a lot more mode of action, I suppose. More than what is the question? So maybe I shouldn't say more. But there's a lot. There's a lot of potential there for us to act on. The will is limited, but despite its limitations, there's still a lot there for it to choose. Much in the way that the will is limited, it is still something that can be shaped, modified, influenced And like this, I think about the field, and I think about space as a physical concept, or a concept within the field of physics that has a definition as such. On one hand, I feel as though this space is not necessarily arbitrary, but it is so fundamental that it is difficult to grasp. That if I had to do a quick definition of what space is, the definition is that space is the boundless, three-dimensional extent in which objects and events exist and have position and direction. Likewise, time is the continuous, measurable progression of existence and events from the future, from the past, and the present. Now, space-time together, we have this four-dimensional fabric called space-time. And there is influence on this space-time by the objects that are within space and time. And it's a curious thing to me that space seems to be defined as an object in and of itself, because it is something that can be, or at least conceptually, we see it as something that is affected, that it is an identity that is bent by the mass of an object, let's say. But such a boundless space that includes these objects it would seem that it does not. On one hand, there used to be this sand pit when I was younger, in second grade, that the kids would play in on recess. Probably not the best idea if you're a teacher to have kids playing in a sand pit and to walk back in the classroom and be all sandy, but nonetheless, there was this sand pit, and this was the environment through which we could build things. And of course, the effect that we can have on it was quite large. We can build all sorts of things that the sand itself could not form itself into. The objects that played within that space had an effect on that space. And I have to wonder, about the nature of the sandbox. Because at one time we can say that the sandbox can be seen as something that is all-encompassing of our experience. And we could draw all sorts of different analogies and whatnot from the underlying substrate that is the sandbox, just like we can draw all sorts of analogies about the fabric of space-time and how that is influenced by things that exist within it. And conceptually, I also wonder if I'm a bit limited here in my understanding. But nonetheless, I mentioned that I found a curiosity with the concept of space-time. And the curiosity, I suppose, does not extend much farther than the idea of this limitation. Now, what do I mean by that? That we define our experience, our field of operation by these qualities. And it is not to say that this is not the way that things are. Of course, these are things that are observable and testable. That is why we think them to be true. And certainly, I am of the opinion that of our will, there are certain things for which we are limited by, that we cannot surmount, by virtue of our experience and the way that we experience reality. But all the same, the field is quite limited, if not for the mind. It doesn't, while it may encapsulate existence, it doesn't define existence. Existence seems to be of a different type of question, at least as far as a conscious agent is concerned. But at the same time, I find it strange that what we might call something as open space is not as open as we might think it to be. For given something as massive as our Earth, and given that it is a sphere floating out into this space-time thing, and yet by its nature it attracts something to it. It bends the seemingly absent reality into something that we can feel, something that we experience as the effects of gravity. And I find this interesting because of the concept that I've discussed a lot in the Proverbs as it relates to evil, that of nothingness, that of absence, that of no-thingness, is more of a Vervaekian term. That there can be something that extends in all directions, and as far as we are concerned, has no solidness to it, at least voiding the particles and things that might be within it. And yet, what we may perceive as absence and nothingness is still responsive to things that we would consider largely physical objects, things. And it is by this that it shapes the, what we might call, behavior of the surrounding environment. They are known by their effects. And given that there is a conscious agent thinking about this, verbalizing it, it is also seemingly clear to me that as much as I can feel the effects of the fields on my body, keeping it in this chair, I feel the effects of consciousness on my mind, on my experience, on my endeavors to find something that is good, to find something that is known, to find something that is true. And so in the case of both the field that the woman plants her seeds in, and the field in the sense of physics, they are both these unseen potentials. The medium where unseen forces take visible form through interaction, care, and attention. And that within the mind, when we are thinking about the mind as a field, we may say that wisdom shapes the moral field, our choices ripple outwards, love or wrath shapes relational fields, our presence may shift the atmosphere, attention and intention transform space, as is the case with the woman in the field. So thinking about this in broader terms then, I come back to the woman that is working in the field and all of the intuition that she possesses about what she can and what she cannot do with the potential that she is given. She, as this conscious agent, as this earthly, I want to say earthly body, but earthly body in the sense of a physical object that exerts some effect on the forces that surround the massive object. Her mind is like this massive object. It is agentic, and it shapes the moral field. And it has its effects into the physical domain, obviously, because her intention leads to the production of a vineyard. The production of the vineyard leads to the production of material that is necessary for the maintenance of the body and for the furthering of a household, for the furthering of relationships, etc. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time with our last chapter here on verse 17.